I did I did not prepare a full-fledged lecture, but rather a collection of different aspects and ideas that I wanted to put forward and propose for the discussion after my short presentation. So as you can see, I do have a plan, starting out with a fundamental question, whether the Middle Ages are relevant, moving on to the notion and the idea of dangerous Middle Ages, and I want to present you some aspects where the danger actually lies in contemporary references to the Middle Ages, and then come to the global Middle Ages as core of my presentation. Bear with me, I prepared far too many slides for 30 to 40 minutes, so there are many slides that I will just skip over. If you find anything of interest and you need or think we should come back to that, please keep that in mind and we will do so. So on the outset, I want to start with the question of the relevance of the Middle Ages, which started intriguing me a few years ago when I started preparing a volume together with two colleagues, Chris Jones from Christchurch University in New Zealand and Conor Costick from Dublin in Ireland. And we were kind of dissatisfied with the classical arguments that are often put forward in order to justify the relevance of doing the history of the Middle Ages. The classical arguments, you've all heard them. You have to know where we come from in order to know where you're going. On the one hand, but on the other hand, also the use of history, but especially the Middle Ages in the Europe of nations today to legitimize the current organization of society and the political structure via looking at its origins. All of this, personally, I did not consider, I never considered really very satisfying and convincing. And you might add other elements to that, besides this focus on the history of the nation and the legitimization on the nation. We also have approaches that try to underline the importance of looking to the Middle Ages and actually analyzing the history of the Middle Ages by certain phenomena, institutions, but also objects and practices that still exist in our modern day society. So whether you think of pasta that have been invented in the Italian 12th or 13th century, the invention of glasses that I myself rely on dates back to the Middle Ages, obviously, but also the very structure that we are currently talking, that is the university. Still, I am strongly convinced that it's in many respects much more important to be a good optician and know how to work the glass rather than know the history of the glasses in order to make things function in our contemporary world. So now the slide doesn't move forward. So there are many different kinds of arguing for relevance of the Middle Ages. I would put the accent a little bit differently by stressing, on the one hand, the inspiration we can actually draw from looking at our more remote past, if it comes to the identification of alternative pathways or possibilities that open up and that allow us, when we look at our own past, the more distant past that is, and think about how things could be different. So it invites us not to take for granted all the notions, the ideas, the structures we are growing up with in our contemporary society and that we kind of take for granted. So there are aspects like, for example, the identification of a linguistic community with a cultural nation or a nation per se. If we look at composite states of the Middle Ages, where it is quite usual and widespread to be multilingual and to function in a multilingual mode, we learn to better perceive borders as constructs that can change over time. We also learn how social structures and communal organization could be organized differently. Just think of, for example, the works Elinor Ostrom did on the dimension of common goods. I think that these are much more helpful perspectives we can develop when we look at the Middle Ages and argue for their relevance. And an additional layer of argumentation has been furnished in a number of publications already something like 2 or 3 decades ago by German historian Otto Gerhard Oechsle, who argued that actually the Middle Ages are a genuine and necessary element for the development of the concept of modernity itself. So either when you think of the constitutive formation or the constitutive moments and the constitutive elements of what we identify modernity with and modern thinking with, they either use the Middle Ages as a negative backdrop in order to argue for everything that had to be overcome in order to become modern, or on the other hand, they deplore what we consider to be modern developments and argue for kind of an orientation towards a more harmonic, more holistic view of human existence by looking back to the Middle Ages. But in any case, all of these concepts of modernity kind of refer already and always and inevitably to the Middle Ages. So Otto Gerhard Oechsle would have argued, or has argued actually, that the Middle Ages are very much inscribed into the DNA, the very DNA of what are modern societies. And thus, in order to understand modern society, you have to know about the Middle Ages, which is kind of a more systematic argument that I find very much convincing. Beyond that, there are also these dangerous elements that we are confronted with in different contexts in the contemporary world. And I would like to focus on that and just give you a few impressions of these in the following few slides. I will go through them quite rapidly in order to just give you a certain idea, and then come to the dimension that really interests me today, that is the perspectives on the global Middle Ages and the problems and the chances that go with them. For what is coming now with a kind of dangerous Middle Ages that I mostly identify with political references to the Middle Ages, I want to stress that most of these phenomena that you could quantify as abuse of historical references are currently cultivated by right-wing or extreme right-wing parties or individuals, even though formerly left positions also played an important role in this context when images of the anarchic Middle Ages were put forward and cultivated. Also, the emergence of socialist idea of common goods has been underlined. So in the work of Karl Kautsky, for example, when he was thinking about the origins of socialist ideas, an author like Cosmas of Prague, who depicted in his Bohemian history an ideal kind of communist socialist community before the invention of private property played a major role. But nowadays, when we look in our contemporary society, most of the references to the Middle Ages come from different interest groups that can still include left-wing or more tolerant movements, but they are most strongly cultivated by the right-wing parties. One example of where the Middle Ages start beginning to become dangerous is actually furnished by the use of Joan of Arc in modern-day France. I just put together a few of the images that demonstrate, or a choice of images that demonstrate the very presence of Joan of Arc as a historical reference in modern-day France, and also mentioning a number of identifications and interpretations that go along with it. So according to the interest group that refers to the figure of Joan of Arc, she can become, a French woman in a national sense, or in the sense of a growing or nation in birth in a certain way in the 15th century. She can be referred to as a saint, as a strong woman, thus becoming an example for feminist movements. a victim of critical church politics and national interests, that with a critical stance that is more left-wing. So there is a certain multiplicity possibly available in order for references to Joan of Arc. But if we look at the current political discourse in France, it becomes relatively rapidly clear that the most intensive references come actually or are cultivated by the political right. So in 2022, for example, a very problematic historian who represents the extreme right wing in a really revisionist sense, Eric Zemmour, declared his candidacy. He ended up with below 5% of the votes in the end, but nevertheless, he had a very strong mediatic presence. And he is very much known for distortions and falsifications of history, actually. So in one of his interviews, he had proposed the idea that, for example, the Vichy regime in Nazi-occupied France actually tried to protect the Jewish or the French Jews, which is a position that, on the grounds of all the serious historical work that is available nowadays, can really not be held, but has to be declared a strong distortion of what we can observe on the historical facts. So historians organized against Eric Zemmour, but nevertheless, his images in his campaign were widely perceived, and he played on these figures and reference to the Middle Ages by trying to present the ideal image of France as a Christian country, a royalist country, that very much ties in with the vision he wants to propose from a very right-wing perspective for current policies. Now, you could say that this is a fringe and marginal figure in France. Still, these images, these ideas are circulating, and they do so not only in France, but references to the Middle Ages appear over the last years, and you might have seen many of these images I'm going to present you now in a very rapid sequence. Do kind of express a kind of worldwide trend. I show you an image from an alt-right demonstration that happened in summer 2017 in Charlottesville, in the United States, where you can see the clearly right-wing orientation with the German swastika. And in the crowd of this gathering, you also see different kinds of references that transcend the historical periods by starting out by using the Othala rune from the older Futhag rune alphabet. So harking back to the Middle Ages in a certain way and evoking the idea of Viking history, Viking traditions, with all the implications of whiteness, of male culture, partially also flowing over into Christian culture, but with a very strong pagan accent in this case. And they, without any further ado, they connect this from, or the historical references they evoke from the Middle Ages via the Nazi period to their own present. In the right, I show you the use of the rune in the emblematic of the 7th SS Division Prince Eugen. Other images that evoke or that hark back to the Middle Ages include the use of the black eagle you can see on the shield here. And it might have come as a surprise to the young, well, basically you have to call them fascists or Nazi, that you see in this picture, that actually when you look at a late medieval, early modern product like the Hallisches Heiligtumsbuch that presents the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire, St. Maurice, he actually would see a person of color holding the emblem of the Black Eagle. Currently, these ideas that hark back to the Middle Ages or try to evoke the manly white Christian culture of the Middle Ages, the allegedly, this kind of alleged image of the Middle Ages, still circulate, and protagonists of these movements occupy very significant roles in current US politics. For example, here you see pictures of Pete Hegseth, the current Secretary of Defense of the United States and the tattoo Deus Vult that clearly evokes this idea of crusading, battling for the Christian religion and engaging in Christian conflict. While all of this can be said to be relatively harmless, there are individual examples that we can identify that have made the news in a worldwide level that go to more extremes. I only want to remind you of the terrorist attacks that happened in summer 2011 when Anders Breivik first exploded some bombs in the parliamentary quarter in the city of Oslo, and then went on to shoot an enormous amount of people on the island of Utøya. 69 people died during these shootings. The bombs explosions left 8 people dead. He was in the following, when he was apprehended. Afterwards, he was condemned to 21 years of imprisonment that should be followed by perpetual preventive custody. Now, the important thing for us in this very context is that in order to explain his deeds, he had published online a long manifesto of nearly 1,000 pages that he entitled 2083, a European Declaration of Independence de Laudi Nove Militiae, Pauperis Commilitones Christi Templique Solomoniti. So he refers to the propaganda treatise, you might say, by Bernard of Clairvaux on the newly established order of the Templars in the early 12th century, in order to present himself as the Justitian Knight Commander for Knights Templar Europe and one of several leaders of the national and pan-European patriotic resistance movement, and to develop a discourse throughout this entire convolute that is profoundly anti-multicultural, anti-feminist, and anti-Islamic, always trying to justify his own positions by referring to what he considered to be more or less correct representations of medieval phenomena. And Anders Breivik was not the only one. So I will skip over this page. I just wanted to show you an excerpt from this manifesto where he refers to concrete individual moments that he presents in a way that no serious historian would subscribe to nowadays. When he says, for example, Charles Martel successfully defended Europe against an invasion launched by the Umayyad Caliphate in 732 at the Battle of Poitiers, current France, in order to underline his own battle against the Islamic invasion as he perceives it of Europe. So we have to do with the distortion of medieval elements, but at the same time the use and abuse of the Middle Ages that become immediately present in our contemporary world. Another example is furnished by the attack that you will certainly also have heard of, that happened in Christchurch in Aotearoa, New Zealand, by Brendan Tarrant in March 2019, that left 51 people dead. And in the weapon he used, he had lots of inscriptions that evoke numerous historical references, like the Battle of Tours, also with 732, but also the name of John Hunyadi, and the examples could be multiplied by the other pieces of his equipment. I will rapidly go over that. All of this is obviously not new. We know these phenomena also from the Nazi period, for example, when they were applied in a very astute way. For example, in the newly developed decoration in the 1940s or in the late 1930s in Braunschweig Cathedral, in order to justify the ideology of creating new space to live, Lebensraum, as the Germans say, in the East. And obviously, there are further examples that could be multiplied nowadays in the use in the political discourse. I won't comment on Russia and Putin here, because you all know these phenomena much better than I do. What I find quite disturbing and interesting, however, in this very context, is that it's not only about these extreme and clearly identifiable phenomena, but we can actually witness developments, especially in France, and that's where my expertise comes from, that kind of try to infiltrate popular opinion by means that at the first glance kind of could appear innocuous. For example, by using the entertainment side of theme parks in order to slip in historical ideological distortions that are usually also governed by the perspectives of the far or extreme right. And these are much more difficult to criticize, because if you look at the extremist terrorist attackers that I just mentioned, they can easily be identified and deconstructed in their discourse. What's going on here in these theme parks in France is much more innocuous because there's a discursive asymmetry. The theme parks attract the attention of the public by promising in a certain way that you could actually engage with history of the more distant past, live history, experience history. But when historians start to criticize them in order for distortions of their historical presentation, the abusers, that is the organizers of the theme parks, usually start to oscillate between positions, thereby slipping through the fingers of criticism, if you allow me to put it that way. Because on the one hand, they use the playful promise of authenticity in order to attract, like you can see in the poster that you see on the left of the slide, where they say history is just waiting for you, so come to us and experience history. But once they're criticized for distorting actual history, they refuse that criticism because they, in their own words, only want to entertain. So you can't really get a hold of them by applying the usual critical rational discourse that historians would usually develop. And this use of theme parks like the Puy du Fou, which is one of the most famous here in France and a theme park of enormous success. So in 2024, for example, they had nearly 2.5 million visitors or tickets sold. Perhaps people are visiting on several occasions. 2.5 million tickets sold. So their reach is much more important than any potential publication of critical historians. And actually what nobody knows, or what few people know in this very context, is that the person behind this very theme park, the Puy du Fou, which is here criticized in that publication that you see here on the slide, and critically analyzed in its presentation in this publication. So the owner and thus the author of the ideology, who is Philippe de Villiers, a French billionaire, former high civil servant and right-wing politician, who is basically first and foremost Catholic, but in such an extreme way that he actually becomes extreme right-wing in many of his positions. He kind of disappears behind the organization of a theme park, because in contrast to a book publication that he also does, where you clearly identify the author with his work, in the context of a theme park, many of the visitors, they simply are not interested or don't see who the actual author is. So all of this has very heavy ideological implications, because it leads to a strongly distorted image of the Middle Ages, which is difficult and problematic on two levels. On one level, because it uses history or abuses history in order to legitimize certain political positions in our current present. And seen from a medievalist perspective, like I am one, it also distorts our image of the Middle Ages, which are usually presented as white, Christian, male, a little bit violence prone also. And all of these pictures also appear and pop up in many of the productions of popular culture, where you can see a quasi absence of people of color, when also in settings where fantastical medieval words are meant to be constructed and presented. I gave you here a few stills from the series Game of Thrones and the advertisement for The Lord of the Rings. So what are the problems with this situation? Am I just exaggerating if I qualify that as dangerous? On the one hand, we have phenomena of whitewashing and structural racism on two levels, because the Middle Ages are clearly presented in these contexts as white Middle Ages via the exclusion or ignorance of non-white elements, in order to become ideologically viable and usable for the right-wing movements. On the other hand, it also has serious consequences on the sociological dimension of the medievalist community itself, where non-white medievalists often feel discouraged from participating in the discourse. I will skip over the next argument and the idea why the very widespread notion that you can often find in the media that certain non-European cultures actually are like the Middle Ages, like the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which is really extremely problematic because it kind of evacuates our contemporary problems by doing as if this was only a problem of the past, and refusing to see that we are dealing with contemporary structural phenomena. So what are the reactions to all of that, and why might the reactions also be problematic? There is a large project that already started out at the latest in the 1980s of the subaltern studies that try to give voice to the subalterns that are usually excluded from this whitewashed image. On the one hand, in order to correct our image that we have of the Middle Ages, and on the other hand, also to kind of welcome the subaltern societies, communities, and nations that have largely been kept outside of the mainstream of history writing, to welcome them and get them out of the waiting room of history, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has called it. But there are also problems going hand in hand with that. And we can witness, for example, in the medievalist discourse, that we have a growing movement of what you could call identity politics, where you really, or where people ask themselves who is entitled to say and write what about which communities. So if you want to do women's studies or gender studies is a bad example because everyone is gendered in one way or the other. But if you want to do women's studies, can you actually do that as a man, etc.? So there are lots of virulent debates going on here. And there's a certain risk of new distortions that go hand in hand with a movement that I'm trying to outline in the next few minutes that are remaining for my time. That is the opening to global influences to create a more colorful Middle Ages. That result to that I have, or problems that result from that, that I have mentioned here, where we still struggle to get the right balance and equilibrium between different positions. So I wanted to talk to you about the global Middle Ages that I had the pleasure to publish a short article a few years ago in the French journal Annales, together with my colleague Thomas Yertlem from Berlin. What do we hope to get from that? I mean, there is first and foremost the need to observe or to state the fact that actually the global Middle Ages are, as a notion and as a movement in research, developing for at least 2 decades now. The notion is relatively well established in the meantime, even though there are very vivid debates around that. And there are quite a number of difficulties going along with that. So on the one hand, what we hope for would be a conceptual opening that might allow us as a discipline to develop a broader notion of the Middle Ages, or even overcoming the Middle Ages as a notion and as a concept, by looking at global context and including them. It's a debate that is going on. On the other hand, it might help us, and there's another hope invested in globalizing medieval perspective, to include cultures into our image of the past that were hitherto largely excluded because they rely in their cultural organization and practices less on writing than many European cultures of the Middle Ages do, which invites us to develop new methodological approaches and refine these approaches. So that's the conceptual theoretical side of these things. There are also elements on the material or content-oriented side of things that go hand in hand and that make us hope for improvement when we're doing global Middle Ages. That is the possibility to develop more adequate ideas of contacts and transfers in a qualitative and quantitative, dimension, but also to avoid erroneous conceptions of what is normal and what is the exception by getting a better idea of how pre-modern human societies might function in their broad cultural diversity. And there's an additional background to all that you have to keep in mind if you think about the current trend towards globalizing research in the Middle Ages. That is due to the material turn that has been developing over the last 10, 15 years in European medieval studies, and a growing interest in objects as cultural artifacts. And with the objects, we are invited, and with our analysis of the objects, we are increasingly invited to broaden our fields of inquiry when we actually want to know how they were produced. So think only of the use of African ivory for objects that are produced in medieval Germany in the 13th or 14th century, the use of African gold, etc. And I brought you here a little bit disturbing image that has made the rounds 2 years ago in Germany, because what you can actually see under one of the teeth is a little bluish spot in this lower jaw of a woman that has been buried near the monastery of Dalheim between 1000 and 1200, which is actually a little piece of lapis lazuli that has thus needs come from Afghanistan, and that attests to the at least merchant networks that ensured the presence of this material in a women's convent in high medieval Germany, where a woman was writing and drawing with blue color thus. When we start talking and thinking about the global Middle Ages, we have lots of discussions to lead. And actually, if you look in contemporary research, there are very intriguing debates going on all the parts of the notion. First and foremost, with the Middle Ages, which become extremely problematic as a category in order to do periodization in a broader geographic horizon than merely the European one. The Middle Ages already have become difficult for the European time and have been criticized for decades now. So Jacques Le Goff, the famous French medievalist, for example, underlined that actually Joan of Arc, which you can see on this slide in the middle, lived chronologically much closer to us than to Charlemagne. But nevertheless, by putting them both in the Middle Ages, we put them in the same category that we perceive to be more distant from us. But what are we doing now if we look in a broader geographical scope at the existence of Emperor Huizong, who lived in the early 12th century and who represented in a certain way a totally different idea of rulership than Charlemagne did. So there are notions going on about the notion, or there are debates going on about the notion of Middle Ages that is perceived to be Eurocentric and thus carries with itself the risk of imposing yet again a colonial violence on the societies that are described by using that term. And the difficulties that go with the applicability on the level of content. It doesn't necessarily correspond or the periodization we usually use in Europe, so Middle Ages between 500 more or less to 1500, doesn't really correspond to historical developments in other parts of the world outside of Europe. And it also distorts the picture of non-European cultures, as some authors have argued, like the German specialist in Islamic studies, Thomas Bauer, who claimed that the Middle Ages would not be applicable to the Islamic world because the Islamic world lived through a golden age in the period that we would describe as the Middle Ages, so it can not be the Middle Ages, which are, as everybody would know, kind of a problematic and dark period. The other problem goes with the notion of global. What do we mean by global when we look at the Middle Ages? Can we speak about global history? Can we envisage a global history before the age of globalization that sets on in the 19th century? And the question does have been asked whether there's anything really global in the Middle Ages before that time. There are certain problems that we are facing when we are looking for alternatives, for example. So Eurasian period has been proposed, middle millennium. Both of them do not really solve the problem. So we're caught in a kind of conundrum, and the global Middle Ages as a notion for the moment is mostly used as kind of a pragmatic approach. But I still cling to it, and I would strongly advocate it because it helps us to better understand many and better see many aspects and phenomena that we are interested in when we look at the Middle Ages, even if we focus on the European context. It helps us, first and foremost, to refocus our perspectives. So I brought you two pictures, two slides here that show you the relative extent of different huge or large-scale political or rulership organizations, where you can clearly see that the famous Carolingian Empire is actually not necessarily so impressive when compared to other political entities at this very time. And the same holds true, especially when you look at the 13th century and compare, for example, the Holy Roman Empire with the Mongol Empire at the period of its largest extension. But what do we see when we try to develop globalized perspectives, and why should we develop globalized perspectives? I want to start out this little part by looking or by showing you these two artifacts that have been found in modern day Scandinavia. So textile remains from a Viking Age ship burial that has been found near Stockholm, carrying the name Allah written in Kufic script in the textile. So it clearly found its way from a faraway region, probably from someplace in the Middle East, to northern Scandinavia in the Viking period. And the same holds true for this Buddha statue from Helgö, or that has been found in Helgö, nowadays Sweden, that is dated in its production to the period between the 6th and 8th century, and has been produced in Kashmir, and has been deposited in Scandinavia in the ground before the 11th century. So we have these connections, and if we want to adequately understand the range of phenomena in the Middle Ages, we have to follow them in order to get an adequate idea. And if we start doing so, we are inevitably also invited to look at parallel phenomena in other regions of the world when we try to globalize our perspectives. I brought you here a very famous example that has been identified something like 20 years ago by maritime archaeologists, a shipwreck that has sunk probably in the early 9th century that was on its way from southern China to Persia, and that carried first and foremost, these ceramics you can see on the picture on the lower right, which have been produced in Hunan in southern China, but using a style of decoration that is very en vogue in Persia at that time. So at that time, this ceramics have been produced for mass export to Persia. So we can see a world that is heavily interconnected, especially in the region around the Indian Ocean. I will skip over that. This is a graph that tries to show these kinds of connections that we can identify for the period of the 8th to the 10th centuries. We can also see more globalized connections beyond the merely European geographical sphere in the age of the Crusades. You already probably know about that, and a heavy impact of horizontal mobility when we start following merchants and merchandise all around the Mediterranean, but also, as has been shown following the works of Janet Abu-Lughod in the 1980s, on a much larger scale, where we can actually identify several core regions that are actually as of the 13th century at the latest, heavily interconnected, implying all the three continents of the known old ecumene. These develop in the 15th century, for example, with a stronger focus from southern and western, or especially southwestern Europe towards the African continent. So we have a recalibration in these phenomena, but we have strong ties that we have to take into account. And how does that help us to better understand what's happening? I just want to focus very shortly on the example of travelogues and travel narratives. In well-established European research as of the 1970s and 80s, lots of research has been done on travel narratives that actually give us the first impressions of the European discovery of the Far East by travels to the Mongols and then further on to China. That is one dimension that has been very intensively been scrutinized and analyzed, usually under the perspective of telling people or telling the narrative that at the latest from the 12th or 13th century onwards, Europeans start traveling and thus prepare for the further Europeanization and European expansion onto the entire world as of the 16th century after the so-called discovery of the Americas by Columbus. Now, the thing is, if we try to apply globalized perspectives, we can actually try and invert these images and can create counter-narratives by looking, for example, at the 13th century story of Ba Sauma, a Christian monk who grew up near Beijing. So he was Chinese Catholic, and then traveled to the West, actually spent a long period in Persia and was sent as an envoy to Western Europe, traveled around Western Europe, and left us his own narrative. So it is not about the story we tell about Europeans traveling to the East cannot be upheld anymore if we take into account the counter perspective that we can see if we look at Syrian sources, at Chinese sources, also at Arabic and African sources, because what is, for example, more than a myth is a figure that appears in the 14th century in European sources also, is the king of Mali, Mansa Musa, who has converted to Islam and as a good Muslim also started traveling while going on his pilgrimage to Mecca. And the Arab author Al-Umari left us a very vivid account in which he tells us how rich he appeared when he came through Cairo, and he brought with him so much gold that actually the price of gold fell afterwards because he distributed so much by giving away gifts in Egypt. And we can also refer to the travels of the Chinese Admiral Zhang Ho, who went all the way to Arab in several traveling campaigns. We can also refer to phenomena of the microbial globalization that happens at the latest in the 14th century with the expansion of the Black Death. And all of that, if we want to, and that's the really interesting point for me as an historian, if we want to take all these histories into account and also give their own history to regions like, for example, in Central Africa and Western Africa, etc., we have to discover or to develop new approaches in strong interdisciplinary cooperation with archaeologists and with the philologies, because we don't have the written sources we are used to deal with usually. But if we want to really write not a cultural portrait of these societies, but a real history that we acknowledge to be a history, we have to develop new approaches to our ways of history writings. And that's where the real methodological challenge actually comes in. And that's not only true for African societies, but also if we look, for example, at what we call the medieval period, or the time that we identify as the medieval period for regions like Polynesia. But all of this is really worthwhile doing it because it allows us to refine the ideas we have also as European historian. And I wouldn't define myself as a global historian. I'm really a European historian when it comes to refining our image. I show you here an image, and I'm slowly coming to an end. I'm already over my time. I realize that. Please bear with me just 5 minutes. What I show you here is an image that results from the Portuguese African contacts in the late 15th century. So the kingdom of Congo has already been Christianized in 1491. King Nzinga Mbemba was baptized, took on the name of Alfonso, and started exchanging letters. We have a real correspondence as of this moment with his homologue, King Manuel I of Portugal. Alfonso's own sons, Henrique and Francisco, studied in Portugal, and Henrique became a bishop. He was consecrated a bishop in Rome and then sent back to the Congo in order to function here. And what we can clearly see here in this picture, that is taken from a book of nobility, that dates to 1521 by Antonio Godinho. It was done in Portugal and is kept in Lisbon nowadays. We can see the effects of that integration, because what you can see in these pictures is a constellation where you can see the coats of arms of 4 kings. The King of Scotland, the King of Poland in the upper register, and in the lower register, now I have to look, the King of Bohemia and the King of Congo. So color doesn't make a difference. Inclusion into aristocratic and Christian society makes the difference. So we can see how certain configurations of the inclusion of non-white elements function quite differently from we are prone to believe, or what we were long time prone to believe. And if you look at this picture that shows a harbor scene in Lisbon in the mid-16th century, you can see on the foreground a figure on a horse in the right foreground, a black person who is clearly a noble knight riding on horseback. So we have to reconfigure our idea of how white, how Christian, and how male the Middle Ages were. Now, this is only on the white aspect. And in doing so, we have to take care not to overstretch things, because we have to ask questions like how representative, for example, is the so-called Lincoln man that you can see on the upward left here, who has lived, that's a reconstruction on the basis of his human remains, who has been buried in the second half of the 13th century in Lincoln, and who was of African origin, we can clearly say that, and who was integrated into his monastic community in Lincoln at that time. So how representative are actually examples like that? I will skip over that and finish with 2 slides. So what I would like to propose, and I tried to develop that in that short article that I co-edited or co-wrote with Thomas Ertel, is to keep in mind and consciously expand our horizon, not only by following well-established contacts where we can see clear influences, but also try to profit from contrasting collections of example. Like here, for example, you can see on the left a noble of King Edward III of England, who clearly defends his own royal ideology and his claims to France and England, the French throne actually, in this gold coin that he printed in order to pay the soldier for the campaign that he led in France. And that shows himself as a king, that puts him in a portrait scene in the middle of his coin. And the bronze cash from the Han Dynasty, that's what Chinese money looked like. So the Chinese rulers actually used money in quite a different way. And once we recognize these differences, we can also try to inquire further and try to understand in new ways the specificities of what we can actually observe in Europe. So to end, my plaidoyer would be that whatever name we call it, whether we talk of the Middle Ages or global or world or whatever, or connected, the main thing I really want to argue for is that we have a very strong interest in history writing concerning the medieval period by becoming more global and diversified in order to get a more adequate picture of the period we're interested in. And I find it extremely important to consciously combine different scales, to always change between the micro level and the macro level in order not only to kind of lean back and see the huge structures, but for getting the details on the ground, we have to combine both of us. This will help us to be better in touch and also better able to criticize contemporary discourses and problems, like I try to evoke them with my references to the dangerous side of the Middle Ages nowadays. And it might also help us to work in new constellations in the field of history writing, where we very much have the traditional attitude of working individually, leaning back, sitting in our offices. We can no longer do that if we want to globalize our perspectives. Nobody is in a position to be able to work with all the different languages that have to come in, Chinese, Arabic, different European languages, etc. But we have to work in teams, and we have to work in teams on an equal footing. So this is also a sociological project that if we work, for example, on African history here at the Institute, the German Historical Institute in Paris, we do not want to go to Africa and work on Africans, but we want to work with our African colleagues in order to also learn from them how they do their own history writing. And we have to keep certain things in mind, certain dangers that go with that. We should not be satisfied by leaning back and writing classical political history now, because we're cheerfully identifying points of contacts. We still have to ask specific questions. So that's a very important point, I believe. We have to develop approaches to quantification for the pre-modern period, which is extremely complicated. But if we want to really get an idea of how important certain phenomena are that we can identify, like the Lincoln Man, like the exchange between Congo and Portugal, we have to quantify them. We have to be aware of institutional mechanisms. So we talked about, you told me about the merger of the different institutes for historical studies. We always lose jobs, or we are in the risk of losing jobs if we are kind of putting together different specialities. And we have to be very aware of social and political rollback movements, because as far as I can see it, especially here in France, the new right and the traditional, the new right and the extreme right-wing parties and prominent members of them try to propose new national narratives, harking back to the roman national, as the French say, of the 19th century, and thus kind of propulsing us back to the entrenchment in the national and nationalist boxes. Oof. Sorry, I tried to get through that material as quick as I could. There's lots of more to talk about, and I'm looking forward to your reactions and your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ошема. This was really very fascinating and informative and stimulating talk. So a lot of food for thoughts. And now the floor is open for the discussion. If you have a question or comment, please raise your hand, and you may ask your question or comment. I don't see any hands. Maybe I would start at, as I said, I'm not a medievalist, but I am 18th century historian, and I have a very practical question. Yeah. Now I am a part of a large international project that aims to write a comprehensive global history of Ukraine from ancient times to the present. And there is a question how to write a global history of one country or a single territory. Is it possible? Is it kind of worthwhile undertaking? Yeah. And if we write something like this, what should we focus on? Are there any good examples of such histories, global histories of single countries? And for instance, recently we have had two impressive, I think, books dealing with France and Germany. First is France in the World, a New Global History, edited by Patrick Bouchereau, and Germany in the World, a Global History by David Blackburn. So they are different, yes. So first is kind of collected volume, and the second is written by one author, and it's more coherent. So what do you think are these good examples of global history? Or what would you recommend to look at as a good examples of writing global history of Middle Ages, and not only of Middle Ages?
Yeah. This is a very important question, and I'm in no position to really give recommendations. But what I can share with you are my impressions and my reflections. So I very much admire both of these works. The Global History of France that Patrick Boucheron edited is very inspiring reading, with a large number of short chapters that develop very sometimes surprising facets. So you can find, for example, one chapter on the global history of Chanel number 5. So what ingredients do you need in order to produce the perfume? And that leads us on these globalized traces. On the other hand, it has the serious disadvantage, and that is one of the criticisms I have towards the recent or the globalizing recent work of Patrick Boucheron and other works that are inspired by this model, that they actually fragmentize our picture. So you can find very inspiring fragmentary reading, small chapter on this, small chapter on that, kind of splinters of historical developments or phenomena, but they abstain programmatically from proposing a synthesis, an overarching narrative. And that's a problem, because our readership in many cases rightfully expects us to provide a synthesis, to provide an overarching narrative. We have readers, we have an audience who want to know, how has this developed in a kind of complete picture. So that's a problem that goes along with this approach that has inspired many others. So you have the same model also for the German example, etc. Now, what David Blackburn does, on the other hand, is this kind of synthesis. And the attempt to do that when he asks about Germany in the world. And he feels relatively at ease with that enterprise once Germany becomes a national unit, as of the 19th century. That's the moment where his specialization kicks in, because he's very much rather an historian of that period, starting with the 18th century perhaps. And it becomes much easier to actually ask yourself, what is Germany actually? Because when you look at the earlier chapters that come closer to my own specialization for the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, for example, he doesn't really, he picks up examples, but he can't clearly identify, why should these people be Germans? So what's holding his object together? And that's one of the central difficulties, I would say. If you are, I'm in no position to give an adequate idea of what it means to write in history of Ukraine. I can only, for example, refer to the French or the German situation, where it simply makes no sense at all to speak of Germany in the 8th century, because there's not even a word for that. There's no political unit that covers what we would perceive to be Germany, more or less. And even for the late Middle Ages, many of the inhabitants, but also the rulers of the different territories, they didn't necessarily perceive of them as German. They perceived of them as part of the empire. So the Duke of Savoy, for example, in the 15th century, he speaks French. He has large territories in Italy and in nowadays France. But he perceives himself to be a prince of the empire, but he wouldn't claim to be German. Now, is he a part of this history or not? So we have several moving objects there that complicate this story very much, I would say.
Okay, so if to somehow sum up, it's very difficult to marry national and global history. And it's better not to try.
I mean, you have inevitably a kind of conceptual tension if you want to write a global history of a nation in any case, because the very advantage, one of the core advantages of globalizing perspectives is to make the category of the nation not necessarily obsolete, but more marginal. So the idea would be, or the question would be, why would you want to write a global history of a nation anyway, instead of a concrete phenomenon? Like, for example, the gold trade in a certain period and exchanges, or religious exchanges. But why stick to the category of the nation when you try to globalize the perspective? I don't say that you shouldn't do that, obviously not. But all I would invite every author is to consciously reflect about what it actually means to speak of the nation. Because when I look at my German or my French context, the very entity that I would call Germany varies over time. So that's only a kind of a wish that I would pronounce to have this kind of reflection in order to be able to engage with it afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Professor Adadurov, please.
Bonjour. Si vous permettez, je poserai mon question en français.
Ok.
Très bien, Fora. Ok.
D'accord. Je suis très heureux de vous voir dans le cadre de nos séminaires méthodologiques et vous avez bien exposé la réception du thème de l'histoire médiévale au niveau de la culture populaire contemporaine. C'est-à-dire, vous avez porté notre attention sur l'instrumentation de l'histoire médiévale au niveau de la culture populaire, du discours politique par les courants politiques tout à fait différents mais toujours radicaux, par les créateurs des films et de la culture populaire. C'était très très intéressant quant à moi, mais je suis intéressé surtout sur les perspectives de faire utiliser l'approche globale dans des études médiévaux au niveau de l'historiographie. Voilà, mon question concerne la comparaison entre l'approche du père de l'histoire globale, Fernand Braudel, qui n'a pas hésité de faire étudier l'histoire médiévale. Aucun de ses élèves, il me semble, n'a pas hésité décidément de faire étudier cette histoire, outre Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie qui a rédigé l'histoire du climat depuis l'an 1000. Mais Brodel liait son approche avec la notion du capitalisme où il n'existe pas, ce n'est pas l'économie globale, il n'y a pas des échanges sans capitalisme, il n'y a pas de relations commerciales, démographiques et les autres sans le développement de l'économie, de l'échange et du capitalisme sans monnaie, etc., etc. Il me semble que la question du Moyen Âge global, c'est la question qui un peu déconstruit l'approche précédente telle que l'économie de Weltwirtschaft ou l'approche de Max Weber qui a insisté sur l'éthique du capitalisme comme la condition nécessaire de l'existence du monde global. Comment vous pouvez discerner ce problème en coïncidence entre le capitalisme qui n'existe au Moyen Âge et la notion de l'histoire globale? Я не знаю, Володимир, чи треба перекладати українською?
Maybe not, but if Professor Ошема could answer in English, it would be nice.
Merci d'avance de votre réponse.
Well, thank you very much for that question. That brings us back to the discussions about the very notion of global in that context. So what does global mean when we're looking back at the Middle Ages? So when you refer to that connection that Brodel led to broadening up his perspective beyond the Mediterranean, when he was looking on the global history of capitalism, and this interconnection, this brings us back to the question whether or what we want to call global. So if you would speak with my German colleague Jürgen Osterhammel, he would tell you that a global history becomes only possible once the world has been globalized. And these are already different categories and phenomena, because on the one hand, we're talking about a series of real events, that is globalization. On the other hand, we're talking about a perspective that we apply in order to interpret phenomena. The global perspective, that is the historian's analytical perspective. So these are situated on two levels. Now, for Osterhammel, both levels, in order to be meaningful, to be applied meaningfully, would have to go hand in hand. So before globalization, no useful global history. I think that the German historian Michael Burg-Golte developed actually quite a good argument in order to not really counter that, but to develop grounds for globalizing perspective. So actually, usually I would not say that I'm a proponent of the global Middle Ages, but I'm very much for globalizing perspectives. And that's where I think the secret lies. So the idea would be that in contrast to the established models of world history or universal history that have been cultivated in Germany in the 1950s, 1960s, that were kind of either overarching narratives of human civilization, perhaps also in the sense of Toynbee, in England, Arnold Toynbee with his huge work, or a collection of individual chapters that were just put together, where you say the High Middle Ages in Europe, the High Middle Ages in South Africa, South America, the High Middle, etc., and then bind them in one volume. Globalizing perspectives for medieval history in a fruitful way means actually asking very concrete material questions. So identify a problematic, and then follow on the basis of this problematic its ramifications in space and through societies as far as it leads you. So if you're, for example, working on female literacy, I showed you the lower jaw of this woman from the German monastery with a piece of lapis lazuli between her teeth. If you're working on female literacy in high medieval German monasteries and female book production, this invites us to globalize the perspective, not to remain on site and be kind of satisfied with the written sources we have for the immediate context, but to see how this monastery is actually taking part in worldwide networks that brought the lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to high medieval Germany, and how. So it's this problem-oriented focus that should lead us in our globalization or globalizing of perspectives in the Middle Ages. So this would be a different project from your global history of Ukraine, because the entities are much more that lead the interrogation are much more material orientated entities and identified problematics instead of certain, be it political, be it cultural units that you then try to situate in the fields of influences. Does that partly answer your question, Professor Adadurov? Because I don't subscribe. I mean, I'm a huge fan of many of Max Weber's approaches in interpretations, but I don't subscribe to his theories concerning, let's say, the comparative level between different cultures. I simply think Weber was not right and was not really fertile in many of his approaches, but has a clearly Eurocentric agenda that doesn't help us to see the phenomena for the pre-modern period in other cultures adequately. We lose, because if you, for example, if you lose or if you use the modern notion of state in the ideal type that Weber develops, no medieval realm will ever live up to this category of state. But we don't win, we don't gain anything if we say that. They're all lacking. But this doesn't make us better understand, or this doesn't help us to better understand how the functioning of power and organization goes. So I would really put Weber aside here.
Great. Soumya, please.
Yeah, hello, good evening. I'm sorry without camera because I'm right now on my way in Flixbus from Germany to Ukraine, so sorry about this. I actually teach a course in global history at UKU, but this is kind of like unusual project, so I teach it on behalf of another professor. His name is Jeremy Adelman. I'm not sure if you know him or not, but he is also a certain like specialist in global history, and he has his own approach. And we usually start our course with Silk Road. And this is the time when he says that it was so-called early globalization. Then from Silk Road, we have Black Death, and then we go to Mongol expansion, where those things are happening simultaneously. And so his argumentation in terms of why should we start talking about globalization in this time, in 13th century, like looks pretty logical to me, because I would think that starting to talk about globalization only in 19th century would be too late, because then it would be just impossible to explain how the things are connected and how the things are dependent. Because for me, global history, first of all, is not the history of only interconnections, but also of interdependencies. So how the regions are interdependent between among themselves. But what I always hear from my students is the question, why don't we talk about antiquity? Why don't we talk about antiquity, the ancient period, and why we do not include Hellenistic period in global history? Because let's say, if we will compare it with even Mongol expansion, yes, those processes looks pretty similar. I don't have an answer to this question, but I was curious whether there is a discussion about including antiquity into global perspective on different kind of conferences, or maybe in the circle of researchers who are specialized in global history. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an excellent question. I'm not really qualified to answer it, I'm afraid. But what I can observe from my outside perspective is that there is a growing tendency to kind of broaden the perspective of especially in late antique studies, where an increasing number of colleagues becomes conscious that actually in order to get an adequate idea of the functioning and the context of also the Roman Empire in late antiquity, you can't simply stop in the Eastern Mediterranean and then the immediately neighboring realms, but you have to include, for example, the entire cultural sphere that goes hand in hand with Syriac Christianity, that leads you automatically all the way to India, for example. So this is considerably broadening the perspective in this context. I'm not entirely sure whether even for the Mongol period, I mean, there are obviously, when you think of the Silk Road and the expansion of the Mongol, the rapid expansion and rapid decline also of the unity of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, whether this makes in a material level a very good argument for really talking about globality and globalization, because obviously you are still limited to the kind of ancient ecumeny of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and not going beyond that. So I think that all these arguments about when is it really global are not particularly, I mean, they are totally justified in a certain respect. And if you are interested in processes of concrete globalization on a material level, there are very strong arguments to do that and to develop that. And I think everybody would acknowledge that, well, on the level of concrete and immediate interdependency, the 19th century would be crucial with the new technologies of transmission, of transport, of transmission of information, etc. But even before that, you can argue for a globalization of perspectives in certain fields that you problematize, and that would be my argument. And follow the invitation to kind of try and globalize the perspectives as far as we can do inside the ancient and medieval ecumeny. So that would basically be my proposition.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments? I don't see any other hands. I have another question, if I may. So, if we speak about this global Middle Ages, yes, so you said that we need to go beyond Europe and to include other cultures, not focus only on Europe. And here we have a methodological problem how to give voice to the cultures that we illiterate. We can do oral history, obviously, yeah. So could you elaborate on this? So how can we solve this methodological problem, and is it possible to solve it in kind of some adequate way to give voice, yeah, not to impose some European vision of these cultures, but to try to get to their own self-representation?
Yeah. I think it's that's really an excellent question. I find all the discussions that go on in this field very exciting without being able to claim any expertise myself in that. But I think it's a very strong invitation to intensify interdisciplinary cooperation. Meaning that, for example, if we're looking at the history of Africa, and I very much admire the works that have been organized and coordinated by my colleague François-Xavier Fauvel. We automatically see a very flexible way to accept and include the contributions of onomastic studies, for example, of oral history, as you say, especially archaeology, obviously. And try to elaborate what can nevertheless be accepted as an historical account. And that's the real challenge. If I had a recipe for that, I would publish it and hopefully earn a lot of money. I don't have that recipe. It's a challenge. But if we look, for example, on specific parts of European history, it's not as if this problematic would be entirely unknown. I mean, when we're talking, for example, about oral transmission that has been put into writing by early ethnographers in the 19th century, let's say, for example, and we deplore for certain contexts in Africa, and we deplore the chronological distance, we always have to be aware that when we look, for example, at the Scandinavian sagas, they are our main written source for things that would have been the case in Iceland, in Greenland, 300 or 400 years before. And so we are encountering the very same difficulty, the very same problematics in European contexts. And I think we have a strong interest to try and engage that discussion in an intercultural way also, in order to try and learn from what the others are doing. So this research in European medieval studies, research into orality has been very prominent in the 1990s, and then as of the early 2000s, people stopped talking about it in a certain way, but without giving an answer to the problems that we are confronted with. And I think that the development of globalized perspective and also the exchange with specialists of other cultural areas all around the globe might be a very opportune moment to get back to that dossier, open up the dossier again and see what we can learn also for European history. And as I said, I'm a European history. I won't try to deny that. What I can learn from my own speciality, from the inspiration that I get from that exchange.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. You have the last chance to answer the question or to comment on the talk. If I don't see any hands, then
Can I just add,
okay, yes,
please,
please go ahead.
Sorry for not raising the hand. Regarding your question, Pane Volodymyre, so for example, in my course, we do a big emphasis on visual sources as well, as the one who can help us better understand certain aspects. When we work with students on different case studies from different parts of the globe, we never take a one-sided point of view, and we would take the sources from different perspectives. So one is written by European, another one would be written by indigenous people. Let's say if it's the case study about the let's say the war for independence in the United States or something. Another thing is I think that the good global history is impossible without environmental approach. So and climate. So Professor Adadurova already mentioned the short history of climate by Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, and I think that also using the types of sources like this that help us to look at environmental history as well. So they help a lot in explaining and also understanding certain processes like revolutions and uprisings and different upheavals that were happening in the world at the same time. They just really help to explain certain things. Yeah, but this is just my opinion. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, obviously. Thank you very much for that. Obviously, I totally agree. That's a very important. Important aspect that, especially in the context, for example, in research about the Black Death and the decline or the crisis, whether it was a crisis or not, we can debate, of the 14th century in Europe and beyond, has played a very important role. Just a short comment on the question of the multi-perspectivity. I mean, that is exactly the point where you say we choose a source to present the different perspectives. When we go, for example, to Mali in the 14th century, the period of Mansa Musa, we have Arabic texts that give the outside perspective, but we don't have indigenous texts. So how do we deal with that? So we have this asymmetry, and that's a real challenge. I don't have an answer to that, but we encounter this challenge in different kinds of contexts. And I think if we want to have a meaningful methodological discussion, we don't have to blend this out, but really try and engage with that Even if at the end we say, well, we only get this side, so we simply try to find our way in the dark and deal with that. But even without knowing how we would deal with that categorically. But we shouldn't ignore this problem. That's all I say.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any new hands, so maybe this is a good time to thank again to Professor Ошема for this really very inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I think you made a very compelling argument about the relevance, innovativeness, and also dangerousness of the Middle Ages. In East European context, we feel this dangerousness because Middle Ages were used to justify the ongoing war we lived through now in Ukraine, so it's also very relevant for us. But thank you again. It was a great pleasure, and we hope that this contact and cooperation will develop. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time, the invitation, the time and the exchange. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.